Yes, I know 1 + 1 = X. Before my mathematicians start jumping in the comments saying that no, that's wrong because 1 + 1 = 2. Just chill for a second, because what we're going to be diving into is that no, if we're dealing with a stricter linear situation, then that's true. But in this video, we're actually going to go a little bit deeper, and we're going to actually talk about things like consciousness, your brain, and all that kind of stuff. So this one's going to be really interesting, So if you didn't catch the first installment of this series, I would encourage you to go back to that. And trust me, it's not nearly as long as the other videos I do when we're talking about the news and stuff. But in that video, what our goal was to first set the table by basically clearing the table. And what I mean by that is that, this whole idea that we live in a world that's made up of stories. We looked at the origin of stories, and, we looked at how ancient cultures, how they use stories to basically to convey, lessons or to educate, or, just passing down, events. That was how they received their news and gave news and all that kind of stuff, right? Then we hit the fast forward button a little bit and talked about how as villages turned into kingdoms and kingdoms turned into nations, and how, stories became something a little bit more of a tool to basically use it, for control and manipulation and all of that. And that brings us to today, where we see that in overdrive, and I talked about how even the news that we watch, when it starts off, what do they start off telling you? Today's top story. So we talked about that. And then, of course, we got into religion, where religion in of itself is basically man's way of trying to interpret what really is hard to explain within nature. And so we talked about that, and we kind of left it there. So now that we've kind of identified that, yeah, we do live in a world that's really built around stories. I mean, I forgot to mention even social media. Every social media post that you see is really a story, And so in this video, now that we got the table kind of cleared off, now we can start getting into some of the more deeper things, right? And so in this video, we're really going to get into consciousness, right? So let's go ahead and dive into that. So when I say 1 + 1 = X, what I'm actually saying is this, is that our bodies, we've talked about this, and we're going to get into it more. It actually is constantly producing things that go beyond what the system predicts. So one of the things I'm kind of leading to that I'm very, very excited about is taking a much deeper look at African culture. And when you look at African culture, the centerpiece of African culture, and when I say culture, I'm acknowledging that Africa is made up of many different cultures. But in all of these cultures that you'll find throughout Africa, the centerpiece of many of these cultures is the drum. And when we talk about the drum, people from outside of these African cultures, they just simply look at it as someone just banging on a drum. It's just music. But within African-based cultures, it's more than that. It's a way of communicating. It's a way of timekeeping and memory and calculating and coordinating and all of that stuff. It's a whole lot that's built into the drum. I mean, the drum was really a centerpiece. Even when you look at the slave revolts that took place all throughout the Americas, the drum was a centerpiece. It wasn't just, oh, I hear the drums from a distance, it's time for us to fight. No, in those drum beats, there was time, there was coordination, there was all kinds of things, and was able to take the drum, that same drum, and dance to it and create all types of different dances off of the drum. So the drum is very instrumental when you sit back and really think about it, as it pertains to African-based cultures. Man, the drum we're talking a very multi-dimensional kind of instrument here. Now, if you've been watching I Show Speed, in his travels throughout the continent of Africa, I have been really enjoying myself. I've been taking my time with it. You know, it's not something I would just want to gobble down. I really want to take my time with this because, man, he did a wonderful job in reintroducing all of these different African cultures. Well, he was in West Africa, specifically in the Ivory Coast. And I'm going to play the clip, but he was doing his shot, taking his shot at doing what they would refer to as the world's hardest dance, the Zauli, hope I'm saying that right, dance. And I want you to take a look at this clip. It's really quite interesting. So take a look at it.
I'm here in the Ivory Coast, and this is the hardest dance to do in the world. Let's go. Are we about to do it? Ready? I'm ready. Let's go. Come on, chat. Hardest dance to do in the world. Come on.
Okay, so now let me play for you this clip. This is another one where speed isn't in this one, but I want you to take a look at this clip as well. It's the same dance, but I just want you to look at it.
Did you know that the most difficult, ankle-breaking, complicated dance in the world is the Zawali dance of the Guru people of Côte d'Ivoire, West Africa? Don't just take my word for it. Watch. Pay special attention to the feet.
Here's something that I just learned that I didn't know. Big shout out to my son on this. Is that dance? You know, typically when we hear drums and we see people dancing, we just assume that it's the drum that's leading the way, but not in the case with this particular dance. It's actually the dancer that's leading the way of the drums. In other words, the drummer is paying attention to the foot movements of the dancer, and based off of the foot movements of the dancer, that's where you're hearing the drums, the different beats and all of that stuff. And that's, so it's taking its cues, not from the drummer, but it's actually taking its cues from the dancer itself. And this is really deep once we start getting into this. So let's go a little bit further on this. But we may return back to the drum in a moment here. Now, do you remember we also talked about grandma in the kitchen, grandma the mathematician? You know how grandma in the kitchen, she just instinctively knows how much she needs in terms of ingredients, how long it's supposed to stay in the oven, and you know how much sweetness, how much salt to put in, how much to make. All of this she does just by simply observing and feedback loop. And that feedback loop is basically testing, tasting it, and saying, it needs a little bit more of this, or it needs more of that, so forth and so on. All of this is basic mathematics. Now, if I was to take a mathematic book to grandma, to a lot of our old school grandmas, and say, okay, this is calculus, this is physics and all of that, most of them probably wouldn't even get it. But they do get it by way of expression. If you were to sit down and to observe how grandma cooks in the kitchen and that whole process, that's mathematics in action. It's the same thing with the drummer as well. Same thing with the dancer. The dancer is doing all these different movements and stuff based on physics, based on a whole lot of things that are going on. See, when it comes to, I'm focusing on African-based culture, our culture, even though a lot of times I've heard different historians talk about how they just come to this conclusion that somehow African-based culture was somehow ignorant or less intelligent, because especially when you're looking at sub-Saharan African cultures, a lot of the stuff wasn't, a lot of the languages were not written down. It was based off of storytelling, passing down from one generation to another, expression through art and all of that kind of stuff, drums, music, that kind of thing. That is how we express communication. And so when these colonizers came in and it was like, okay, where's your written text? Their assumption was that we were less intelligent. But no, that's not true at all. We were just using a different type of intelligence. Now let's jump to jazz music. Now, jazz music is probably one of the easiest things to look at. When you look at going back into history and the modern instruments that we have today, you know, there was a lot of things as black folks we were kept from, but we always would listen, right? So when we would hear people playing the trumpet, the saxophone, the trombone, or whatever, or the violin and all that kind of stuff, in most cases, the greatest musicians that black Americans had, and we're just talking black Americans now, they didn't have any formal training. They simply looked at the basics, the baseline. All of this I'm going to bring back to you in a moment. So just put a little check mark by the word baseline. What was the baseline? The baseline was how to hold the instrument. So if we're dealing with a saxophone, how to put your finger placement, where to place your fingers. Same thing with the trumpet, where to place your fingers. And having the understanding that I can also combine the two keys or two buttons and I can get a different sound. Then also paying attention to, well, it depends on how much air I blow out. That can have a variation in the output, the sound. You know what I'm saying? If I play the trumpet, I can shake it a little bit, just tremble it just a little bit. I can get a very unique sound out of that as well. So this all came by just simple observation. So we saw the baseline, we pay attention to the baseline, but then there was something else inside of us that took that information and said, okay, now we can take it to the next level. Now we can go to whatever, right? So that brings us back to 1 + 1 = X, because 1 + 1 = 2 would tell us that, okay, if I hit these two keys, that's going to be a B flat. Right? But a jazz musician is going to say, I can hit these two keys and it's going to be a B flat, but it's going to sound different. I'm going to stretch that thing all the way out to it sounds, I'm just stretching it out to as far as I can take it. So that B flat, all of a sudden, it sounds like something almost different, but it's still categorized as a B flat. That's what I'm talking about. So it's not just this rigid, straight up and down thing that I'm talking about. I'm talking about our instinct ability to take the linear things and to stretch it out into something that almost looks very unique. And so it's like even in our cooking, when you look at the history of soul food, you know, the soul food that we created, we took something that was very linear, just very basic ingredients, and we were able to stretch, add our creativity, and we was able to add all kind of things to it. And so what may have just been regular macaroni and cheese, well, it turned into something different, didn't it? We added our own little flavors. We added this, added a little that. We made sure that it was crispy on the top and all of that. That all came from what's already inside of us. So all of these things, these examples I'm giving you, they're not rooted in calculation. In other words, it's not just rooted in, okay, here's the formula, follow this formula, and you're going to get this output. No, it was rooted in tuning. Now, this is where it's going to really get deep, and I'm very excited about this. So let's go. So let me tell you this. Now, more and more scientists now are starting to conclude that consciousness, what we know as consciousness, is not rooted in the brain. It's not rooted in the brain. See, we've been taught that consciousness is rooted in the brain. I'm going to give you an example in a moment that will help you to understand that. All right. So let me give you an example. Let me give you an example of that. Do a search right now after this video, but I want you to do a search on YouTube for NDE experiences or near-death experiences. Okay. And when you listen to a lot of these people who've had these near-death experiences, many of them will tell you they were sitting on the operating table and everything. I think it's called the EEG, not the EKG, the EEG. I hope I got that right. And what that does, that monitors your brain activity. And so many of these people will tell you that when they were dead, clinically dead, it was, which means that there was no brain activity, right? We're not talking about it was a little bit. No, there was no brain activity. But yet these people will tell you about these experiences of them flying off and seeing everything that was in the operating room, having the ability to hear conversations in other rooms, going to other rooms, traveling to their home, going here, going there, and all of that stuff. But they're clinically dead. There's no brain activity. But then they come back and then all of a sudden they're like, I'm back. And guess what? I saw what you said. And then they're able, and the people are like, whoa, snap. How did you know that? You were dead. It was like, I was standing right next to you. It's kind of like what they do in Hollywood. You know, in Hollywood, how they show these movies, like, you know, I'm dating myself, like the movie Ghost, for example, where he's like going around and he's seeing all of this stuff like in real time, but he's dead. Well, that actually does happen. There's many examples of this where people have had these experiences where they are clinically dead. There's no brain activity, but yet they are having these experiences where once they come back into their bodies, they're able to tell in detail everything that was happening while they were, quote unquote, gone. Well, that's a great example of what I'm talking about when I say that your consciousness, it doesn't dwell in your brain, because if it dwelled in your brain, well, guess what? None of that would have happened. Once you're dead, you're gone. That's it. There would be nothing else. So I want you to think of this. Your brain is actually a receiver. Think of it like a radio. Okay, I don't have a radio in front of me here. Who does these days? Or your phone. Your phone is a radio. Okay, your phone has an internal antenna. Your phone, that antenna is connected to a specific frequency within a specific frequency that's within a wide range of seemingly endless frequencies. Right? Your phone, depending on your carrier. Okay, so if your carrier is like Verizon or AT&T or whatever, let's just go with AT&T. Most people recognize AT&T. Now, the FCC, the Federal Communications System, says, okay, we got this band of frequencies, right? And we're going to allocate this particular band of frequencies to AT&T, right? And so AT&T is like, okay, thank you. Now, AT&T is saying, okay, we're going to offer a cell phone service. Now, we have a cajillion amount of cell phones. So within this allotted bandwidth, we're going to take this slice of band and we're going to allocate for every cell phone a certain frequency, and then it goes across the board, right? And so my phone is assigned a very specific frequency that theoretically nobody else should be able to access. So if I'm using my phone and I'm calling someone from my phone, right? And then my wife, she calls somebody from her phone, we're under the same account, but I'm not going to hear her and she's not going to hear me. Why? Because we are on different frequencies. Well, your brain is kind of the same way when we're dealing with consciousness. Your brain is like a receiver. Right? It's a receiver that is tuned into a very specific frequency. And that frequency is what makes you unique. You're not like anybody else. You are a very unique person. Now, you may have some similarities to maybe people in your family or whatever, but for the most part, you are you. Nobody else in this world is like you but you. And so that's what so your consciousness, who you really are, it doesn't start here. It doesn't start here in your brain. Your consciousness comes from somewhere else. You know what? I'm going to pull up a paragraph. I'm going to pull up a graphic for you, and this will help you to better visualize what I'm talking about here. So let's go. Now, as a reminder to you, in the last video that we did, I told you this one is going to be, we're going to getting a little bit deeper. So if you see my eyes glancing a little bit, it's glancing at my notes that I have on my screen here. So that's what it is. But in this case, I could share this with you. Am I pointing the right way? This right here. There we go. This right here. Let's take a look at this. So, because this will further explain what I was just sharing with you. So let's take a look at this here. So how consciousness emerges. So environmental signals, sunlight, sound, rhythm, silence, breath. All of these things is where consciousness emerges. So when I talk about, and we're going to talk about sunlight in a moment, I'm going to get into that and the importance of that. Sound, certain sounds, like you may even have heard people doing if you go on YouTube, you hear people doing those bowls where they're doing those sound bowls. That's something else as well. All right. Rhythm, silence. Remember I told you silence is when you immerse yourself in total silence, your brain is actually repairing itself. And then doing breath exercises. I can't emphasize that enough. Breathe in, hold, and then breathe out, that kind of thing. Okay, so that, and then I'm going to go through this real quick, and then I'm going to come back to the top, and then I'm going to point out some things for you. Okay, receiver filter, that's your brain, right? What you have here, your brain, your nervous system, your melanin, and your senses. All of this plays a role. Okay. And then let's get to expression and your outcome. So once it receives this consciousness energy, if you will, then it goes to your brain. All right. Then what happens in your brain is that it does what it does. And between consciousness and your brain, that's what helps build who you are, what we know who you are today. Okay. Receiver filter, your brain, nervous system, melanin, senses. Okay. We're going to explain these things as we go on. And then expression outcome. All right. That's your movement, right? Music, emotion, insight, regulation. All right. What you output, what you got out of meditation, breathing exercises, sitting in the sun, sitting in silence, and then it gets into your brain area here. And we're going to break this down. Y'all, I'm so excited. I'm sorry. All right. It gets into your brain area, right? And once it gets into your brain area, the output is just is one expression of what you received via your consciousness, right? And so that's pretty much the nutshell of that. The intelligence isn't in the signal. It isn't trapped into the brain. It emerges through the relationship between the two. So you need your brain, right? For us as humans, we need our brain. We also need our consciousness. But both of these things are mutually exclusive. I was listening to this one scientist, and he was talking about how he can prove that even trees have consciousness. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. Even though a tree doesn't have a brain, it still has a sense of consciousness. We're going to get into that next. So I want you to think of it like this. When the sun, first of all, is made up of all these different frequencies, right? A whole wide array of frequencies. When the sun hits a tree, let's talk about a tree. Let's just look at a tree, for example. The sun in of itself isn't necessarily telling the tree when to drop your leaves. It's not really telling it that. It's giving all just its frequencies that it gives all the time, right? But here's what happens. When the sunlight, when it hits that tree, there's something within that tree that's keying off of that those signals that's coming from the sun, right? And so the combination of what it's receiving from that sunlight and also what's already internal in the tree, plus temperature, right? The outdoor temperature and all of that. What begins to happen, the combination of all of that, that's when you begin to see the tree figuring out, okay, it's time for me to start sprouting my leaves. Okay, it's time for me to start bearing this fruit. It'll start doing that. Then after that, then it says, okay, I've been holding on to this fruit for a long time. It's time for me to start dropping this fruit. So we'll start dropping it. Then after it does that, then it says, okay, it's time for me to start shedding these leaves because winter is coming. All of that, right? So again, this is a combination of what it's receiving plus what's built inside internally. Then you got temperature as well, but it's receiving and what's inside is what's determining or telling this tree how to act, how to respond, the whole nine, right? That's trees. Same thing, we can look at animals, how animals instinctively know when to hibernate, when to do this, when to shed their fur and all this other stuff. It's not necessarily the sun itself that's given that. It's a combination of what they are receiving, their consciousness is receiving, plus what's already built inside of them, their bodies, right? So in other words, the sunlight is giving a baseline signal. Remember, I told you to bookmark that word baseline. I'm bringing you right back to it, right? So the sun is giving the baseline, letting your body know what it is it's supposed to do. So I just covered plants. We just talked about animals. So if the sun just in of itself is that important to plant and animals, how much more do you think is important to humans? Well, it's very important. Now, let me bring this out. When we talk about the human, like human bodies, human people, regardless, you could be black, white, it doesn't matter. Now, when we look at animals, for example, we just say animals just in a very general term, right? So a cat is an animal, just like a giraffe is an animal, just like an elephant or a lion. They are all animals. Fish, they're considered animals, right? We just all consider them different animals. Same thing with insects. We just consider insects, or we just say bugs, right? So a butterfly is a bug. A bee is a bug. An ant is a bug, right? Now let's mix it up a little bit. Can I take a fish and put it in the desert and expect it to live? Well, you can expect all you want, but chances are it's not going to survive. Could I take a dog and just a regular one, a Chihuahua, and put it in the Arctic? How long? I know that's a really sad picture to think about. Do you think it would survive in that climate? No. And then we can mix and match what you call it, a dandelion, and plant it in the coldest place on the earth. Do you think it would survive? No, it wouldn't. Why? Because even though we're classifying all of these things as animals, plants, or insects, or bugs, right? They all have their very unique requirements. Well, it's the same thing with human beings. See, we've grown accustomed to just saying all human beings are all the same. No matter how you cut us, at the end of the day, we all bleed red. We're all humans. Yes, we're all humans. But we have to start paying attention to these unique differences that we have as human beings. For example, let's just go by skin color. Okay, skin color. You got people who are very white, right? They have less melanin in their skin. You got people who are, they're a little tan. They tend to be, that's the people that you'll find in what we call like the Middle East area or whatever, right? They're tannish, right? Then you got people who got my complexion, where we got a lot of melanin in our skin. And then you got people who even darker than me, who they got even more melanin than I do in their skin. We got to start paying attention to that, because what does that tell us? What should that tell us? What that tells us is that for people who have less melanin in their skin, well, their requirement for sunlight is less. They don't need to be in the sun that long. They can just be in the sun a little bit, and everything that their body needs, they get it within, speaking in very general terms, they can, I think on average, we looked this up, 15, 20 minutes a day, tops, is what they are required for someone who's considered white. That's all in the sunlight that they would need. Now, someone who has my complexion that has a lot of melanin, well, we need a lot more sunlight, which is why our ancestors, just by my melanin alone, tells us where my ancestors came from. They came from a hot climate, in a climate that had a lot of sunlight, right? A lot of sunlight. Now, let's take a look at my nose. I've talked about this a lot. Now, people that are categorized as black folks, meaning like, let's just talk sub-Saharan Africans mostly. You can also say people in South America in some areas, people who are indigenous to South America. You're going to notice something about our noses. Our noses tend to be wider. The reason why our noses are wider is because of the fact that our ancestors came up through a humid environment, right? And so if I want to live at my optimum, I should be living in an environment that has a greater level of humidity than I would get in somewhere like a New Jersey. Now, am I saying that me as a black individual, I can't survive in an environment that has less humidity? No, I'm not saying that at all. But is it the optimum environment for my body? The answer to that is no. So what I have to do is find ways to supplement or my environment so that I am getting those things that I need. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, so we're getting in a home stretch here. I hope you guys are hanging in there with me. Okay, so now let's push this even further. Okay, so now let's get to the brain here. Okay, again, we're all human beings at the end of the day, but we need to start paying attention to the uniqueness of why we are the way we are, the fullness of our lips. If we're talking about people like myself or people who don't have full lips. Why is that? Why is our hair texture different than other people and vice versa? Why is our noses the shapes that they are? Why are some groups tend to be a little bit more on the muscular side versus some are not? All of these things are telling us that our bodies require certain things. All right. So that's ultimately where we're getting at here. All right. So let's dive in. Let me go to my notes here real quick. So let's get to the brain. Okay. Because we all got brains. Okay. At least hopefully we do. Right. Okay. So the left brain is about order. Remember, we talked about this, right? We talked about this, the left brain and the right brain. So this should be like a review for some of y'all. The left brain is about order, categorization, language, linear logic, stories, labels, and narratives. Now, I remember we talked about this. You may have to go to our Samba Tree YouTube page for that, okay? Because I have a whole series or a couple of videos. No, actually it's on this channel. We did talk about that. I had a couple of videos where we talked about the left brain versus the right brain and what they are responsible for. So real quick, my right hand is basically pulling mostly from the left part of my brain. My left hand is mostly pulling from the right side of my brain. And in that video that I was talking about the left and the right brain, I was talking about how the educational system really drove home that they wanted us to write with our right hand. And the reason why is because it's about order. It's basically a way that we could be easily controlled. That's really why they forced right-handedness, to the point where there were some stories I talked about how they would even discipline children for wanting to use their left hand. It were very hardcore. The American educational system was very hardcore with this because, again, it was directly linked to controlling, having the ability to control the masses. That's really what it came down to. So check out that video if you haven't checked that out. And so looking at, going back to my notes here, so I say categorization, right? So left brain tends to be a little bit, it tends to be more rigid than the right side of the brain. Now, just to be clear, your right and left side of the brain, these aren't like definitive, like your left is absolutely this and your right is absolutely that. Because as you dig into this, you'll find that the left and the right side of the brain, they sometimes will cross. I'm gonna use the word pollinate. Sometimes the right will do some of the left and the left will do some of the right. So it's not a definitive, if I was to slice half of my brain, I would be a robot, you know, or if I just operated with my right side of the brain, I'll be a free bird. It's not like that exactly. Okay, so I just wanted to be clear on that. Here's another thing regarding the left side of the brain: linear logic, stories, labels, and narratives. Now, you remember in the first video we talked about how, you know, the world is full of stories. Why do you think now? I think you understand, hopefully, why it is that this matrix system spends so much time in investing in stories, because those stories are ways that they can control us. All right. In this system, stories in themselves, and remember, they're not bad, but the way this system invests so much into it, well, is a way that they can control the narratives. It's going to get even deeper in a moment, but let's go to the right side of the brain. The right side of the brain is about what? Direct perception, pattern recognition, embodiment, rhythm, timing, and resonance, context over content, and sensing truth before naming it. So the right brain isn't interpreting the signal, it's actually receiving the signal. You know, so for example, you know how you go into a public place or whatever, and you're just like, man, it's just something about, I don't think I need to be in here. Or it's something about this person. I just met this person, but it's just something about him. It's a little off. I don't know what it is, but it's something about this person is a little bit off. That's where your right brain comes in. See, in ancient cultures, they used to flow in that. You see what I'm saying? You see how disconnected we've been, you know, from who we really are? They used to flow in that. That was very regular. So somebody comes into your village, there was this automatic, when you read about the accounts of the colonizers and stuff first coming to these villages, they weren't necessarily like, oh, come in. Hey, friend, come in. No, they had to go. There was a huge barrier that they had to climb before they were welcome into these villages, because they already sensed, they were looking at these people like, okay, there's something off about you. I don't care what you're bringing, but it's something off about you. That is who we really are. That's how we're supposed to operate. So the right side of the brain is tuned into rhythm. That's drums, music, breath, cycles, day and night, emotional tone, environmental coherence, and non-verbal meaning. Exactly what I just explained to you. So let's get to this thing about stories. Okay, this is where we connect our last video to this video and what we're talking about here. And now the left brain. Okay, so for a story, this is what happens. You hear a story, and what happens? They're symbolic, they are sequential, they require a belief, and they require agreement. That's everything that your left side of your brain handles. So when we talk about church, for example, when we talk about Christianity, when we're talking about religion, it is fundamental. It is of utmost importance. In fact, it's a central part of religion, is to tell stories over and over and over, tell the same stories over and over again. You go to church every Sunday. What are they doing? They're telling you stories. How many times are you going to hear the story about David killing Goliath? You know what I mean? And what they'll do is they'll read the text, the foundational text, the baseline will be David killing Goliath. And then the pastor will go into this long riff about how Goliath represents your cable bill. You know what I mean? And then the next Sunday, he'll talk about the same story again, how Goliath represents, the system and how we got to speak to the mountain and all of that stuff. And we'll find all these different ways to tell the same story. So the system is focused on keeping you on the left side of your brain. The Bible itself, when we talked about this, is all about your right side of your brain. It's all about enforcing your life, the right side of your brain. I'm sorry, not the right side of your brain, the left side of your brain. Sorry about that. Well, the Bible doesn't mention anything about the left side of the brain. Oh, yes, it does. Because it always talks about, remember, your left side of your brain is connected to what? Your right hand. So in the Bible, it emphasizes over and over and over again, the right hand of God, the right hand of God, the right hand of God, the right hand of the elders and all of that stuff. It's always emphasizes how the right hand is the blessing hand versus the left side. Well, you don't want to be on the left side of the brain. So that's where in religion, even in Bible-based religion, it really centers on, really honing in on getting you to only function on this side of your brain. Now, the right side of your brain, what does it do? It absorbs tone. It absorbs rhythm. It also absorbs emotional charge, which means you can reject a story intellectually but still carry its nervous system imprint. Wow. Now, this is something here. All right. So if you're functioning with your right side of your brain, now you're thinking, now you can push back. Now you can begin to challenge some things, right? You feel comfortable in challenging. Well, because with the right side of the brain, what you're doing is you're not just hearing this stuff. Now you're looking at, wait a minute now. You're saying that this is a lens cap, but I got some questions because is this really a lens cap? This looks like a coaster. And in fact, it says here, in fact, let me go online and let me look this up. That's now you get into your right side of your brain. But in the church, for example, people generally don't operate on that side of the brain, do they? Because you can't question the pastor. If you question the pastor, you're being disrespectful. Because again, the church or religion is focused on getting you to operate on only one side of your brain. All right. That's what religion does. But here's the other part. But still carry its nervous system imprint. That's very important. Let's get into it. So here's an example. So you got the news on in your house. And, it's giving what the news typically gives you. And that's, bad news. OK, so it can be about crime. It can be about the next war, poverty, economic fear, the next war, whatever it may be. Right now, the right side of your brain will hear that and be like, yeah, I don't believe that. Right. But what happens? What are you picking up? Your body. Right. Your body is picking up those signals. It's picking up that frequency, right? So even though your right side of your brain is like, okay, I don't know about all of that, right? But because you are constantly exposing yourself to this on a regular basis, you are literally imprinting your nervous system. And you're telling your nervous system that the sunlight ain't your baseline. This is your baseline. What you're exposing yourself to, that's your new baseline. So the more and more you are exposing yourself to negativity, even though in top of your mind, you may say, well, I don't really believe some of this stuff. Some of it is actually comedic to me. But in reality, as you expose yourself to this more and more, you are literally imprinting your nervous system. Because again, remember, the right side of your brain is absorbing tone, it's absorbing the rhythm and the emotional charge. Remember, we said that earlier. So your body will register tension in the chest, right? Slightly faster breathing, increased alertness, and a vague sense of unease. And for many of you, that may translate into not being able to have a peaceful night's sleep, because all of this is all baked into your nervous system, because you've just been exposing yourself to this over and over and over and over again. Now, here's another one. Now, this one will hit closer to home. Many of us grew up, in families where our parents may have said, as a black person in America, you're going to have to work twice as hard. Don't trust the system, and the world wasn't built for you. Now, as you get older, you may say, well, I don't really believe that. But because your person was constantly exposed to that, it gets imprinted on your nervous system. Okay, your nervous system accepts that as the baseline, that it has to operate that way. And the way it's evident is you will still end up overworking, staying hypervigilant, having trouble resting, and feel guilty in stillness. Like you feel like, oh, man, I got to be doing something. I need to be working. I need to do something. Because again, it was what was imprinted on your nervous system. So let's bring this all the way back. So this is why it's important when we expose ourselves to sunlight, right? When we expose ourselves to silence, when we expose ourselves to, if you want to do the bowl, when you're listening to those sound bowls and all of that, the different frequencies that bring a sense of peace and sense of calm, what that does, and the breathing exercises, of course, what that does, it's connecting directly. It's bringing you back, your nervous system back to the baseline. Your conscious itself, what we call our consciousness, it's always dwelling in that space. But what we have to do is try to bring those things in alignment as much as possible. You understand what I'm saying? So, for example, nature doesn't stress over bills. Nature doesn't stress over what it doesn't have at the moment. All nature, when it comes to, for example, when a tree needs water, it's not like, oh, Lord, I don't have my clean bowl of water that came from the mountain spring and all of that. No, the roots are going to go, they're going to continue to stretch until it finds some water. You looking at the water that the tree is drinking, you may say, no, that looks ugly. That looks disgusting. It might be some crazy stuff in there. Why would the tree want to drink that kind of dirty water? But the tree is like, listen, inside my body's going to align up to where it needs to be so that I can get exactly what I need out of this water. You understand what I'm saying? So likewise for us, our bodies, the goal should always be to make sure that we are aligning ourselves. We're aligning ourselves to the baseline. Again, what are the baselines? Sunlight, getting ample sunlight, doing the breathing exercises, immersing yourself into silence. I mean, I'm going to keep saying this over and over again until you get it. See that as a reset. And once you do that, it makes it a lot easier for the real you that's inside of you, your consciousness, to begin to start aligning you up to the place that you are supposed to be. You're supposed to be this being that is expressing all types of possibilities. You are not a linear being. You were not designed to be a linear being where you're just producing 9 to 5 results. Aren't you tired of that? Many of us have books, movies. We have all kinds of things, inventions, all kinds of stuff that's waiting to come out of us. But the reason why it's not coming out of us is because we have completely bought into this linear space that we live in. And when we think about African culture in particular, again, African culture is made up of many cultures. I know that, okay? Because people are always going to correct you on that. Africa is not a country. I know. What I'm saying is this: we're not bringing this back, when we are talking about African cultures, our cultures were centered on living like this. We are very expressive. We embody stuff. We embody music. We embody ideas. We embody mathematics. We embody science. We embody cooking. We embody all of these things. And then we express things in such a way where we are constantly pushing the limits. Someone said this and it really blew me away. They said mathematics isn't the result of, mathematics doesn't produce consciousness. They said it's the other way around. Consciousness actually produces mathematics. Mathematics is basically a snapshot of a much bigger world. So you can be very good at doing physics, calculus, trigonometry, and all of that stuff, right? You can be very good at that and get 100 on your test. Okay, good for you. But that's just a snapshot of a much bigger world. And your ancestors have proven this over and over again. We prove it all the time, even in music, how we improvise all the time. As black folks, we are constantly improvising. That is producing the 1 + 1 = X. So what is your 1 + 1 equaling? Is it equaling, is still equaling 2? That's not really a bad thing per se. But what I'm here to tell you is don't lock yourself into that. Black culture is not a 1 + 1 = 2 culture. It's not. It's limitless on what we can produce, regardless of what the system says or requires. It's limitless on what we can produce. And so this is why I wanted to do this, because we're going to continue to go down this hole or tunnel, whatever you want to call it, and we're going to continue to remind you of the greatness that's inside of you. But again, to recap, your consciousness isn't your brain. It's not your brain. Okay? Your brain is simply receiving these things and interpreting it and manifesting that through this earth suit that we're in. Okay? And when we look at the uniqueness of different bodies, black bodies, white bodies, color bodies or whatever, we need to start paying attention to those differences. Okay? They're not just categories are put on a sheet. These are unique differences that our body's telling us, hey, these are things you need to pay attention to, because your unique body has unique needs. All right? So that's it. I told you this one was going to be a little bit longer. We're going to get a little bit deeper and all of that. So I hope you got something out of it. Tell me in the comments, what part did you really like, or what questions did you have, or whatever. Put it in the comments below. I'll tell you right now, I don't have all the answers, but I can share you the little that I know. So thank you again for tuning in. You guys take care, and we'll be talking again soon. Take care.